So this morning, in light of just a question that was asked last week, I'm just going to do a little bit in relation to milk butterfats, and it's actually probably quite appropriate because it was very well described to me by a farmer last week at a group that I was at, that April was a long, slow pull is how he described it. So April has been a tricky month. Good weather conditions, obviously, but the weather hasn't been, or the weather has been in our favour, but in terms of graze outs and so forth like that. But we didn't, with the exception of Easter Sunday, which was obviously quite a wet day in the south in particular. We just haven't had great growth, and those of you that'll be getting the Grass 10 update will know that there's fantastic growth figures being forecast for this week. I suppose not necessarily hugely ahead of time, but definitely in light of the slower levels of growth that have been there all along, we would be, I would say, across the country, we would be quite glad that there's been an uplift in growth coming after coming, and it's come very quickly. And I suppose that presents its own challenges in many ways, but it also may feed into a small bit of an issue, potentially very short-lived, probably with rapid growth in relation to milk butterfats. So as I said, this just came up as a question last week, and it's something that we probably haven't covered with a while maybe, so I just said it was worth maybe taking a look at. And I would suggest that if people have any queries or want any particular topics covered, by all means email me, and we'll do our best to cover issues that may be of concern to you, because that's the idea of this webinar. So I'll just share my screen there now. Okay, so basically, I'll go into the mechanics of it in a minute in terms of how it works. But in relation to milk fat percentage, a huge problem that we have would be generally associated with the potential of a farm to produce milk fat, and the genetic side of things is very, very key. And I would have mentioned this last week. I suppose in general, again, just a very general summary, I would see a lot of farms that have PDs for protein and fat of in or around the 0.1, 0.12, so ranging there from 0.08 up to 0.12, and the 0.08 being kind of the protein figure, and maybe up to 0.1, 0.12, sometimes a little less for the fat figure. And what this table is showing here is in relation to that genetic merit, where like analysis of a large amount of data that's been gathered, so milk records, milk recordings, obviously, etc., and collating that with the PD for fat within a herd has allowed us to create kind of this table here, which will tell you what you can expect your protein, or sorry, your fat to be, your annualized fat to be, basically, in relation to what your PD is for fat. So as you're aware, I'm operating down here in Moore Park, and obviously in an area that was significantly affected by quota down through the years, in the Dairy Gold area in particular, I suppose. And there would have been an emphasis away from butterfat, because there was what will be very unfamiliar to a lot of the younger people, was a butterfat coefficient, which actually reduced your allowance in terms of litres that you could supply. So if you had a high butterfat, it actually hampered you in terms of the number of litres you were supplying. And as a result, people would have bred cows more towards protein than they would have it towards fat. And that has had its consequences of resulting in lower levels of fat, I suppose, in herds than what would have actually been possible, I suppose, if we didn't have a quota situation. People would have been more balanced in the approach that they would have taken. I suppose another factor that would have influenced the breeding decisions around butterfat is that there was a period of time there where science would have suggested that butter was bad, and there was probably less of an inclination to pay for that. And as a result, the value on butter fat in milk was lower. And again, further research, or revised research, I suppose, has shown that butter is actually good for is a healthier choice, maybe even possibly healthier than the margarine that was been suggested in advance in the previous time. And there's now an emphasis, or greater emphasis, in terms of pricing towards butter. And most people will have seen at some stage that your co-ops have adjusted the payment scale to give a little bit more for the butter fat, because it's of a higher value to them now than it was in the past. So that's, I suppose, the context of where our breeding decisions have gone. I suppose what it also emphasizes is that our breeding decisions, which are now taking place, and probably maybe the horse is bolted in relation to it, for 2022 this breeding decisions, but that if we strive to get high fats, and look, I would believe that the advice that we've been given down through the last couple of weeks in particular in relation to breeding should be pushing people towards higher butterfats and higher proteins in terms of their PDs, and that will result in better situations in relation to fat percentages into the future. What this does say, there's a very rough rule of thumb, I suppose, is that if you deduct 0.4 from this, it gives you the lowest point that you're going to go to, or that you would expect to go to at this period of time where butterfat does tend to move around a little bit. So if we take our 0.1s, as I said, which are generally very, very roughly, there's no science behind this figure, but just looking at the ICBF reports or the EBI reports for farms that I've been on doing discussion groups, as I said, we generally sit in or around that 0.1, 0.12 figure for the most part. Crossbred herds tend to have higher figures, and herds that have put a focus on breeding for butterfat over the last number of years are also tending to have higher figures. So if you're sitting at a 0.1% genetic merit, or sorry, 0.1 for PD genetic merit for your butterfat, then it is possible that your butterfat could drop as low as 3.55 on some of your tests from your co-op. And people get very concerned about this in terms of, and we'll see it in a minute, in relation to acidosis and risk of animals getting sick, etc. And in reality, I suppose it is a real concern in a housing situation, and we'll come to it in a second. It's probably a lot lesser of a concern in a grazing situation, but that's not to say that we ignore it either. I suppose the other thing is to point out that we now see young stock coming through that have milk fats that are up around the 0.15, 0.18 kind of figures, and you can see that that's obviously moving the dial upwards in relation to the annual fat percentage. And again, if we apply our rough rule of thumb at 0.4, that means that we're not going to go lower than 3.77 in this situation. And look, it can be transitory enough to that drop in milk fat. And we'll come to the factors involved in it in a minute. But it generally is always a cause for concern for a period of time. Probably more so in April in normal years, I would say, but I think it seems to have be a little bit later, and I've seen it a bit in the last week or 10 days that people are saying that their butterfats are dropping below the 4%, having been quite strong all along. Probably as a factor of maybe supplementation in terms of maybe bits of silage still in the diet for a period there up until a couple of weeks ago because of low growth rates and trying to keep the gap filled. And maybe just grass not growing as rapidly would mean that grass wouldn't be changing the way it normally would change. And as I said, the rapid growth that we're encountering now, it may be a cause maybe a cause and a solution, and you'll see why in a second in terms of the butterfats over the next number of weeks. So obviously breeding for butterfat, we'll say if we can get up into the 0.2s, we're going to be at that kind of 4.3, 4.4 mark. That means we're not going to drop below 4 at any stage, or very likely to, or unlikely to drop below 4. Or if we do, it'll just be a very short dip below 4. And the other thing is that strong genetic potential. If we move down, as we move back down the table here, and we move into the realms of the 0 for fat, or maybe even negative, or even just a slight positive for fat, that can drop obviously there to 3.33 potentially, or 3.28 here in this situation. And that's obviously quite low, and that impacts on milk price. And what we also see is where those herds have weak genetics for fat, they actually stay quite low for quite a period of time. And some herds can run for maybe up to a month or 6 weeks at very low fat levels. And then they kind of seem to adapt again, I suppose, and start to recover again. So that's the genetic side of it, I suppose. Milk fat at grass, obviously the percentage piece of grass is it a concern? There's always this worry, I suppose, that we're talking about grazing nice lush covers of grass or good quality covers of grass to try and drive milk protein percentage, and there's concern around the fiber content of it. If we look at the fully housed system, you can see that there's going to be high levels of concentrate being fed, maybe 5, 6, maybe even more kilos of ration being fed in that kind of situation. Depending on the format of that ration, it could be very high in starch, and the NDF of the whole diet may potentially drop below 30% in that situation. you'll have low unsaturated fats and low milk fat. And then there is a genuine acidosis risk in that situation if your NDF is dropped below 30%. So your NDF is your neutral detergent fiber. So it's your measure of fiber content in the diet. So I suppose it's logical, I suppose, and if we put it in the context of a human person, of a human being, it's like taking in huge quantities of something, a very rich food, basically, and sickening yourself as a result of it. And that's what we're doing. We're feeding high levels of concentrate in that situation, which is very high in starch, very readily broken down. And that obviously creates an acid load within the stomach or within the rumen, and the rumen isn't able to deal with it if it's overloaded with acid, and it actually damages the papillae of the rumen. So the absorption of nutrient is even compromised, and cows can get scoury as a result of it as well. Then we flip over to the grass situation, which is our common situation in Ireland. And I suppose what we get here is a small bit of a carryover effect in terms of what happens in a house situation being translated incorrectly into what's happening on a grazing situation. We have a very high level of forage in the diet in these situations. Even if we are feeding 4 or 5 kilos of meal, we're still up on 65-70% of our diet maybe. And if we're feeding 2 to 3 kilos of meal, we're closer to maybe 85-90% of the diet now being fed as forage. The level of starch isn't very high because we should be, generally speaking, on kind of high fiber type ingredients, high energy in our rations, unless we're feeding very high levels of starch in that, which could cause possible problems. That there is the possible high unsaturated lipid, and that's associated with rapid growth. And I suppose I would have mentioned it last week in terms of just how the fatty acid profile of grass changes just as we move into second round in particular. But as I said, I feel that there's the potential that there's a lag phase there this year because of the way growth has been, and that we're now looking at more that could potentially be a risk for the next couple of days. The flip side of it is, I suppose, with that rapid growth, we're actually going to end up with potentially grass getting too strong very quickly, which means our fiber content is going to increase, which will maybe change or keep that fiber level high in the diet, even though it's not really a concern in the first place. But also it could impact in terms of that the fat changes might be just that little bit more short-lived. In terms of low milk fats in those situations, it's actually it's more driven by high unsaturated lipid in the diet rather than low milk fat being as a result of an acidosis, which would be the case on our fully housed, high starch, high concentrate diet. So I suppose it's not to rule out acidosis. It is something that people need to be conscious of, I suppose. And look, individual cows could potentially get acidosis if they got maybe if they were eating too much ration. If the ration is wrong, as I said, it should be high in digestible fiber type nut that you're feeding now, rather than high starch type ingredients that you would be on when you have silage in the diet. But the actual risk of acidosis, and look, there's often talk of bubbles and dung, etc., being a sign of acidosis. It doesn't seem to manifest itself, and as I said, there's some work being done on it currently. Feeding trials being done here in Moore Park to look at it from a dietary point of view to see are there consequences of rumen health in relation to it. Just I suppose to follow on then in how is this manifesting itself? So what's happening here? So fat in the cow's diet, lush green forage being digested here. We have our fiber digestion taking place. We have our unsaturated fats being converted to CLA, which go to help milk fat production, and we have our saturated fats, which are going into milk fat building blocks, which then come back into the form of milk fat as well. So where we have that adjustment or change to the fatty acid profile, so as I said here, possibility of high unsaturated lipid. So that's just the fatty acid profile of grass changing as the growth habit of it changes, I suppose. That level of unsaturated fat increases, and the CLA level as a result, which is conjugated linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid, which is actually quite good for people. And the Food Research Centre here up the road from me would have a huge amount of work and research done into the benefits, the health benefits for human beings in relation to conjugated linoleic acid and its role to play in human health. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I suppose it's a bad thing from the point of view of farmers that it could potentially be dropping a milk price. So that CLA then obviously it goes into milk fat, which is what the Food Research Centre is looking at, but it does cause that milk fat reduction in dairy cows. And as I said, the genetic side of it will dictate how long that impact is. The last slide was actually just a graph showing where cows were fed the same diet across the board, the only change being that CLA was actually added into the diet of one group, and versus the control, the feeding of the CLA dropped milk fat as low as 3.0% and 3.1%, with no effect on rumen health. And then when it was removed, the diet, they went back to normal and aligned with the control group again. So it just emphasizes that it's probably in the vast majority of cases where we see a milk fat drop in grazing herds, it's been driven by the adjustment or the change in the fatty acid profile of the grass that's growing, and isn't for the most part going to be driven by an acidosis effect. I suppose we are dealing with a product that's relatively low dry matter, I suppose, if we compare it to silage, which we will be trying to get up into the 25 to 30%, maybe even higher for bale silage. So we do have a certain amount more water in grazing diets, obviously. So that does probably contribute to the fact that cows are that bit looser at grass. But again, the key thing to point out here is that rumen health isn't impacted in that situation, and that's very important for people, because you could go running off doing lots of things. And look, I often recommend it to people that if they are concerned about acidosis, a bale of hay available somewhere on the way in or on the way out. I suppose on the way out is more convenient from the collecting yard or from milking, will allow cows to get extra fibre if there is concern about the fibre levels that they're consuming. And you will, 9 times out of 10, I have seen that cows will pick away at the bale of hay as they're passing it. They might take a mouthful of hay, but 9 times out of 10, that bale of hay will still be there, or will survive, for want of a better way of describing it, for quite a long period of time, because the fibre content of the diet in the grazing situation on that farm is not actually an issue at all for those cows. And the cows are able to self-regulate their fibre intake. So they will look for fibre sources. So they will maybe graze rougher grass out of ditches, etc., if they are lacking in fibre. And that's why they will approach the hay and get the hay if they need the extra fibre. And the fact that it's left behind in a lot of cases is indicative that the fibre content of the diet is not the concern, and that's actually the fatty acid profile is the major issue. So that's the summary, I suppose, to sum it up. So fat percentage is going to be affected by the genetic potential of the herd. It's also going to be impacted on the fatty acid profile of the grass, which there's very little you can do about it that we're aware of currently anyway, in terms of maybe there is possibility that there's some breeding stuff that could be done in relation to the cultivars that are being used, but there isn't a huge amount happening in relation to that I'm aware of at the moment. The potential to alleviate that fat drop in terms of the severity of it and the length of it is very strongly driven by genetics. And we can look at that and try to build on that. And it is actually something that can be adjusted and addressed very quickly. If you look at the figures that are available for a lot of the bulls that are available now, you can see butterfat isn't actually that hard to try to dramatically improve, I suppose, because you could quite often get bulls that are easily 0.2 plus maybe 0.3 even for butterfat. So it's quite easy to move the dial in relation to that quite quickly. And then the final thing, I suppose, is that while that rumen or that butterfat drop may be an indication of acidosis, the vast majority of times in grazing situations in Ireland, it's not. It's a reflection of the fatty acid profile of the grass rather than an issue with rumen health. If you are concerned about it, as I said, you can give the cows the option of taking some hay or straw, and the likelihood is in the vast majority of cases that they're not going to take a huge amount of either, because it won't be compromised in terms of their fiber digestion, the diet that they're on. So we'll leave it at that for today. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about dairy beef, just to emphasize the importance of choosing good sires for dairy farmers from both the point of view of calving ease, but also from the type of stock that's going to be generated and the potential for those to mature into high quality beef animals for the farmers that are taking them through to slaughter. So we'll be addressing that topic next week. And I've just had another suggestion in there. So thanks to that person that's dropped in a suggestion there in relation to a topic for covering in the next number of weeks. And I will come to that. And thank you for the suggestions. And as I said, by all means, please do email me some suggestions. I'm more than happy to try and cover topics that you want to hear. I try to have a good handle on what people want to know about at any given time of the year, but that I may not always be on the money. So if you can drop me a line at stuart.childs@teagasc.ie, I'll be happy to try to address the concerns that may be coming in. I won't promise to address them all, but I will try to address them if I can. So thanks for tuning in this morning, and apologies for a little bit of a delay there to start getting going. Thanks for waiting. Wish you all well for the week, and talk to you next week. Thank you.